The CEO desires a torrid night with the shy virgin who accidentally enters his room. I'm your storyteller, so please come in and have a seat. She is completely enamored. James, I'm ecstatic and incredibly thankful to report that we've reached 5,000 family members, an amazing accomplishment made possible by, I just want to take a moment to thank you for your love and steadfast support. Express my sincere gratitude. I sincerely need your affection and assistance to persevere since it inspires me daily to create lovely and affectionate stories for each and every one of you. So thank you very much, and I adore you all, my lovely family. Without further ado, let's get started with today's wonderful now. Let's begin with Elena, who has flawless dark complexion, and she had always been the epitome of poise and calm confidence with her hair in braids. Someone with a quiet, restrained personality who would rather be in the background than in the spotlight. The opportunity to serve as an intern at Wolf Enterprises was one that was both thrilling and she was intimidated by the company's dominance, and Marcus, the chief executive. Chapman, the CEO, commanded respect just by being there, something she had never actually spoke with him, but the tales she had heard about him reaffirmed the strength of given power he possessed within the organization. Elena felt especially anxious today, had rushed through the hours to prepare a key report that she was now expected to present to Marcus himself. Her heart was racing in her chest as she walked down the marble-floored hallway, each step reverberating in the spacious. She had hardly slept the night before, due to nervousness, which kept her awake as she reviewed the presentation specifics to make sure everything was flawless, and her hand trembled a little as she kept the file close to her chest, wondering if she had done enough. She rarely engaged with top executives, much less the CEO, and she was both excited and afraid at the prospect of meeting Marcus Chapman. She was so preoccupied with the report and the need to perform well that she failed to focus on anything else. Observe the turn she made. She intended to go to the conference room, but instead she ended up in front of a Marcus Chapman, the CEO, is coldly listed on the plaque on the big intimidating office door. As she realized her recent error, a chill went down her spine, and she momentarily froze. Elena was ready to turn and withdraw when the door opened and she saw the man standing there. Marcus Chapman, who had occupied her mind for the last few minutes, stood in the doorway, his thick beard and height, broad figure giving the room an unmistakable presence. Framed a powerful jawline, and his cunning, penetrating gaze raked over her. With his whole manner exuded confidence, authority, and a calm focus. His immaculate suit appeared to fit his figure flawlessly with every motion. It was the kind of power that you could feel in your bones, which complemented his captivating and menacing persona. The type that, without a word being exchanged, commanded respect. Elena's breath as their eyes locked. Time seemed to drag on, and for a moment, she reported the error and forgot about her anxiety for a moment. Had just made the way he stood there the only thing that mattered at that time. Towering and dominant, as though he controlled the space in the air Elena's heart thumped in her chest as she breathed, a sudden response that took. She had previously seen him from a distance, of course, but never this close. He had a captivating quality about him that made him near never before. It made her feel insignificant, but strangely fascinated. She had heard murmurs in the office regarding his presence, his keen intellect, and his straightforward demeanor. But Elena recognized how inadequate those descriptions were as she stood in front of him. Was something enticing about him that attracted people while keeping them at a distance? Marcus's gaze never left her as she stood motionless. He didn't talk right away, but his eyes were piercing, evaluating her as though he were attempting to ascertain her identity at that precise instant. A deep warmth flooded Elena's cheeks, and she could feel the weight of his scrutiny making her heart race. Swallowed in an attempt to ignore the intense feeling of being watched, but her thoughts went blank and her throat felt to tighten as she spoke. "Who are you?" His voice was low and powerful. His rich, powerful voice seemed to wrap itself around Elena as her heart leaped through the silence, though she wasn't sure why. It was a voice that surrounded her, making her feel both curious and vulnerable. That required a response, so she rapidly collected her thoughts and forced her mind to concentrate on the current circumstance, saying, I apologize for coming to the wrong room, Elena, sir, she said haltingly. She stumbled and was appalled at how uneasy she sounded. This wasn't how she had anticipated their first encounter, if she had even envisioned one. She had expected a more formal encounter. A formal document handover rather than this sudden altercation. Elena decided to go right away in the hopes of escaping detection. But Marcus's voice pulled her back like an unseen thread, stopping her in her tracks and saying, "No need to depart. You've arrived at the ideal time," he added in a composed tone. Elena hesitated, uncertain of the deeper significance behind his statement. Unsure of how to react, she looked over her shoulder, her heart pounding as she looked into his eyes once more. His eyes had a serene authority, but there was also something too faint, nearly subtle glimmer of interest. His remarks weren't an order, but an invitation. She discovered herself stuck in place, her feet refusing to move, even if her instincts told her to. Nevertheless, she was prevented from leaving by a subtle force in his voice. It seemed as though he had already determined that she would not be leaving, and that insight both frightened and fascinated him. She was caught in his embrace even though she had accidentally entered the incorrect room. Unable to remove herself from orbit, Marcus moved forward, slightly enclosing his presence loomed even larger between them, and as he approached the air, his eyes remained fixed on hers. Elena's breath caught in her throat as the air surrounding them thickened with an unsaid intensity. Throat, her pulse racing as he got closer, and she shouted to turn and run. But she was immobilized by the strength he radiated. He was so close now that she could sense the magnetic draw of his presence. She felt heat emanating from him, a physical force that accelerated her heartbeat. His self-assured and confident demeanor in front of her only served to increase her anxiety. But she was unable to move, even though she knew she ought to apologize and give an explanation. Herself and leave the room, but for some reason that seemed impossible. Elena was speechless, torn between wanting to go away, and Marcus didn't seem to mind her silence because of the odd fascination she had for him. Instead, he simply watched her, silently, intently, as if examining her very being. His persistent gaze made he felt as though he could see right through Elena, as if she were a book with every page written in a language that only he could understand. Realized that she wanted to turn her head aside to escape the burden of his gaze, but she was unable to do so since he questioned her, "Are you all right?" Because there was something about him and the way he looked at her that kept her grounded. Although it was still challenging to read Elena's lips, her voice had become softer and was now tinted with something that might have been concern. Separated, but no words were said. Instead, the quiet lingered between them like a delicate thread, one that might break at any time, and she could sense her breathing getting faster. Was it her imagination, or was there a pulse of electricity in the air that caused her heart to pound in her chest? There was an indisputable bond between them that neither of them could deny. Marcus said, "Please sit." His voice was deep but strangely welcoming as he pointed to the order was obvious from the chair across from his desk. Yet there was something in his voice that made it seem less like an order, more akin to an invitation, and Elena stood there momentarily uncertain of. Her body paused, her mind racing with uncertainty, and her heartbeat confused of how to behave in this situation. She quickly looked at Marcus and then at the chair. Unusual circumstance. She had accidentally come here, but now she was by herself. Wolf Enterprises' CEO, who had always seemed like an inaccessible person, was far away and untouchable. He observed her with a sparkle of his unflinching, steady gaze. Something about his gaze, the deep inquiry in his dark eyes, unnerved her. Gave her the impression that she was being watched through a magnifying glass, yet it wasn't harsh. Rather, there was a gentle about the watchful, even comforting way he gazed at her that made her legs were unsteady, and she hesitated for a mere second before sitting down. She sank herself into the chair in an attempt to conceal her anxiety and project confidence. Despite her heart was thumping in her chest, she folded her hands in her lap, unsure of what to do with them, and her gaze flitted across She tried to stop the butterflies in her stomach by finding something to focus on in the room, but every nerve in her body was. As she sat in front of him, Every muscle was taut, and the air was heavy there was an almost tangible tension between them, and something she couldn't quite identify charged the space between them. In addition to the silence that seemed to go on forever, there was the way he observed her, his eyes never leaving her, as if he were absorbing every nuance of her existence. Feel the pressure of his focus, and even though she should have felt uneasy, there was something about it gave her a sense of recognition that she had never experienced before. Elena. Despite her anxieties dancing, she couldn't help but feel a strange, unexpected sense of safety in his company. Although he was frightening, there was something authoritative about the manner he radiated strength and an indisputable aura that gave her the impression that nothing in the "You're new here, aren't you?" he questioned, implying that the world may harm her while he was close. The question appeared straightforward when his rich voice abruptly broke through the tension. Sufficient, but the gentle curiosity with which he asked it made her tremble. Nodded hastily as though the response was so clear that she hadn't considered providing more context. "Yes, sir. Just an intern," she said, scarcely raising her voice above a whisper. Couldn't force herself to look him in the eye, so she turned her attention to her hands on her lap and spoke a bit. Too quickly and a bit too anxiously, but she was unable to stop herself. She had to get. In an attempt to handle this odd, unexpected meeting without making herself look foolish, Marcus didn't seem too disturbed by her response, but in reality his gaze softened just a little bit. A faint glimmer of laughter flickered in the recesses of his eyes as he watched her, and his lips hardly curled into a smile. However, a knowing smile that was silent had her pulse skip a beat. "I observed you earlier in the building," he said, lowering his voice a little, almost to a whisper. "You possess a certain grace that sets you apart from the others." The praise was surprising. Elena's face suddenly became hot, her cheeks turned a deep crimson, and she was forced to turn away. Her eyes, she had never before been the focus of attention in this manner. She had heard the whispers, but not from someone like Marcus Chapman. There were rumors around the office about his strength, reputation, and untouchability. He seemed to everyone, but now that he was there, everything felt so much more genuine. His comments were so much more passionate that they stayed with her, circling her thoughts. And she discovered that she wanted to hear more from him, something else that would keep her here. He spoke to her in a way that was intoxicating, and there was something magnetic about the way he spoke to her. His deep voice encircled his words as though they were all meaningful and well chosen. Couldn't articulate why, but she felt a strong yearning that couldn't disregard a wish to be perceived by him and given recognition in a manner that made Elena feel both insignificant and important at the same time, making her heart race. Her chest began to flutter once more as she compelled herself to maintain lost poise. She wasn't accustomed to this level of intimacy or attention. She had always been the modest, shy intern who tried to avoid being noticed and quietly carry out her duties. Yet here she was in the CEO's office, getting recognition, that the words reverberated in her head, but she wasn't convinced she deserved it like the others. She was aware that she was unique among the people in the group, and she couldn't help but wonder what he meant by it. Office in her own private manner, but she had never before given it this kind of thought. She was just Elena, the quiet intern who worked hard and kept her head down, but now Marcus was staring. His remarks made her feel as though she were something more than ordinary, feel vulnerable and exposed, but they also increased her want for more of his, focused more on his eyes and the subdued intensity emanating from him. She kept thinking about what it would be like to hear him talk to her like that more frequently, so that she might have his eyes on her. That gave her the impression that she was wanted and seen. Elena found it difficult to remain composed as she tried to concentrate on what she should say next. But she felt her thoughts were disorganized and rambling in all the numerous directions she wanted to go. Anything that would keep him talking, say it, keep him here, keep this peculiar magnetic attraction between them when they were still alive. But she was at a loss for words. "Thank you," she said at last, her voice wavering just a little. "I'm at a loss for words." And they felt like a feeble attempt to bridge the distance between them, but as Marcus's eyes flicked in the corner of her eye, That was all she could manage. He didn't respond, but his lips formed a tiny, hardly noticeable smile, immediately letting the stillness linger between them for a little while. Then, as though he were imparting something, he spoke in a softer tone. He stated, "You don't have to say anything," with an unyielding gaze. All I need to understand the simplicity of his words is for Elena to just be herself. Took her by surprise, and she was momentarily stunned because she hadn't anticipated him to be so open, empathetic, and real when she had anticipated him to be aloof. Despite being frigid around everyone else in the firm, he was still looking. Elena felt her heart pounding at her, like though she were important, as though her entire existence and presence mattered to him. Beat more quickly, and for the first time in a long time, she sensed the rumblings of something inside of her that made her want to stay, since it inspired her to investigate the increasing relationship between. Over the following few days, Elena was unable to overlook the minute changes in the mood began with the small, fleeting things whenever Marcus was around. Fleeting looks in the halls that went on for too long, the way his eyes lingered on her as though he was observing everything she did. So at first she tried to tell herself that it was nothing, and that she was only believing too much that Marcus was merely being courteous, as any supervisor would. But she started to sense something between them that was impossible to deny the more time she spent with him. He seemed to command every area he entered because of his tall, powerful build, which filled the room, and even there was no doubting that his well-groomed, coarse beard added to the air of authority that's surrounding him. Marcus was a man who radiated strength, self-assurance, and a captivating appeal that left people speechless, not only because of his appearance, but also because of the way he carried himself. Elena noticed the way he carried himself, as though nothing and no one could challenge him. She found herself pulled to him in ways she didn't fully comprehend, since he was unique. She was the most reticent and quiet person she had ever encountered, focusing on her work and remaining private. But Marcus helped her feel included, in his eyes were piercing, even frightening, in a way that was both thrilling, predatory, but there was something about it that brought a mixture of longing and fear to her heart. It wasn't simply he spoke to her in a calm, authoritative manner, and the way he looked at her gave her the impression that she was the only individual present, and he had a way of making her feel both insignificant and vital, was something she couldn't get rid of. Even in the midst of the day, she found herself thinking about him more than she cared to admit. His charm had permeated her thoughts at peaceful times when she was with herself. Leaving traces in her thoughts one afternoon, Elena remained late because the office was quieter than usual. To complete a report, the only sounds in the surrounding silence were oppressive, being the occasional rustle of papers and the gentle tapping of her keyboard. She nearly missed the knock on the door because she was so preoccupied with her work. It was a gentle tap, but it was sufficient to. She looked up from the television to see Marcus standing at the doorway, his towering body framed by her stomach turned when she saw him in the arch of the doorway. She hadn't anticipated him. His arrival at this hour was sufficient to cause her heart rate to increase, and she had to resist the temptation to turn away. "I need your assistance with something," he added, his voice deep and soft, yet forceful tone that made her stomach turn. He entered the room without waiting for her to answer. As he entered the area surrounding them, his motions appeared to be controlled and purposeful. Elena abruptly swallowed to reduce the tension-filled air between them. Conscious of his proximity and the extent to which his presence surrounded her naturally, her voice sounded quieter than she had intended, revealing the nervousness she felt as she stood back. Her thoughts were racing as she attempted to interpret her feelings about his closeness. It was difficult to focus on anything else because of the way he was staring at her. In the finest possible way, she was well aware that everything was almost too overpowering. He was taller than her, and his massive body was both terrifying and somehow comforting. "I just need to go over a few things with you regarding the report," Marcus said simultaneously, his eyes never falling. Elena nodded without showing her expression, consenting to anything he needed. She had no other option because she was his intern, but what worried her was how much she wanted to be close to him so she could feel his eyes on her as much as possible. Caused her heart race with anxiety, and when he approached her while standing, his gaze remained fixed. He looked at the screen by her side as she went back to her desk. Something changed somewhat in the atmosphere, causing a sort of tension that made her hands feel clammy. There was an unspoken electric pulse between them, and she wasn't sure if it was her imagination or if he felt it too. She made an effort to concentrate on the report in front of her, but her thoughts kept going to him. He bent forward, his body radiating heat and his cologne's subtle aroma blending with the room's fresh air. Elena froze as he pointed slightly at something on the screen, and his warm breath touched the back of her neck. It seemed as though the world had shrunk to the two of them in that room, with everything else blending into the intimacy. Her pulse was pounding in her chest from the intense closeness of the situation, and she wanted to God he didn't hear it. She listened to his voice while trying to calm her slightly shaking hands. Directives, doing her hardest to maintain her professionalism in spite of the conflicting feelings inside her. But Marcus didn't appear to observe, or at the very least, he failed to recognize her anxiety. His concentration was fully focused on the work at hand, and as he led her, his voice was calm and quiet. Through the report, but occasionally Elena caught a quick glimpse of him, and when their gazes locked, she was able to sense the attraction between them, the unsaid bond that seemed to get stronger every time they spoke. Unquestionably, there was now a connection between them that both excited and alarmed her. It was an attraction that was forcing her to step beyond of her comfort zone in ways she didn't know how to handle, was unprepared for, but she couldn't bring herself to withdraw at every opportunity. Something deep within of her that she couldn't ignore, but wasn't sure where it was ignited by him. Marcus was standing a few feet away from her while she worked late, but she wasn't sure if she wanted to know or if this was leading. Just inches away, she understood that the subtle pull could not be reversed, had taken root between them, and she wondered how much deeper it would get as the days went by. Elena discovered that every time she interacted with Marcus, she was gradually falling apart. He appeared to make a lasting impression on her mind that she was unable to remove, no matter how hard she tried. Even if it was unsaid, their attraction was getting stronger every day and becoming unavoidable. She should have resisted the attraction she felt for him for a number of reasons, including the fact that she knew it was risky. The power dynamics alone with him as her supervisor were sufficient to generate a sea of complicating factors. Yet he was accustomed to receiving more, whatever he desired, as he exercised authority in each room he entered. His tone and the intensity of his eyes gave him a menacing, and although he was attractive, beneath his layers was something softer. Of authority to which Elena was attracted, he did not regard her as merely another intern, but it felt like she wasn't used to being acknowledged by someone, even though she was deserving of his attention. Her heart would pound whenever their gazes locked, and there were times when she thought that she could feel their chemistry igniting in the air, like electricity about to a storm. But Elena's efforts to repress her developing emotions only made them worse. They appeared to get more intense, and she couldn't deny how Marcus made her feel. One evening following a really drawn-out and taxing meeting, Alive was wanted. She immediately consented when Marcus requested her to remain behind and help him with some files, anxious for the chance to spend more time with him. Despite a voice warning her to exercise carefully because he's the final person to exit the conference room, she was left standing by herself in the office's quiet hallway. Glaring contrast to the day's busy activity, the fluorescent lights overhead. As she made her way to Marcus's office, a slight buzzing added to the calm stress that seemed to descend upon her. Walked in and saw him sitting at his desk, looking up from the documents before him as "I'll just finish these files for you," she responded, attempting to appear helpful. Marcus nodded with a slight smile, despite the fact that her tone was more casual than normal. "Thanks, Elena," he said, pulling at the corner of his lips. Smooth and deep, with a hint of something she couldn't quite identify. She began to work going through the documents, but she found it hard to concentrate because of his gaze on her. Despite her best efforts to focus on the task at hand, she could feel the intensity of his gaze. Shortly before she finished, something unexpected occurred as she gave him the final copy. When the hands first touched, it was only a brief contact, yet the instant when their flesh touched, Elena experienced a sudden electrical surge. Body, it seemed as if time had stopped and she could only concentrate on the sensation of his hand. The warmth of his skin on hers, the irresistible draw that went directly to her breath caught in her throat as she gazed up at him, and she noticed that his eyes had changed expression. Previously cold and calculated, they were now darkly intense and solely focused on her in the air. "You've been working hard," Marcus stated, adding that there was a strong electricity between them that neither of them could dispute. His eyes never left hers, and his voice was low and almost personal. The words were straightforward, but they carried a weight, as though they had deeper significance than she could really understand. He went on, "I appreciate your dedication," in a calmer tone. Personal Elena nodded, uncertain of how to react, her thoughts whirling. Everything else was drowned out by the sound of her heart pounding in her chest. She was desperate to say anything to ease the tension between them. However, she was at a loss for words. Her mind was disorganized, and all she could think of was Marcus's expression as if he gently got up from his chair, feeling as though she was the only person in the room and that she was the only thing that mattered at that moment. Desk, and as she moved toward her, Elena felt her pulse change with the surrounding air. Responding more quickly, he was now just a few feet away, and the closeness made her. She felt the heat radiating from his body, and her skin tingled with awareness. She caught her breath as she looked at the raw magnetism that seemed to draw her in. He remarked, "Up at him, her eyes were wide with a mix of surprise and desire, Elena." His voice was harsh, yet sweet as her name rolled off his mouth like a caress. At the same time, she felt a chill as he called her name, because of the closeness of she was aware of it, and felt the weight of his stare as it passed over her. Her lingering on her lips, then her face, and then meeting her again eyes. The distance between them appeared to get less by the moment. Marcus said nothing more, but the tension was thick enough to pierce with a knife. However, the quiet spoke a lot. It was an implicit pledge and recognition of because of their unbreakable bond, Elena was keenly conscious of how her body responded to him, and how because of the intimacy that had grown between them since their first encounter, every inch of her seemed to ache for his touch. Encounter, her thoughts cried out for her to take a step back and put some distance between herself and recollect the borders that separated them, but her body and heart were expressing to her that she wanted him more, wanted to lose herself in the warmth of his touch and intensity of his stare. She sensed the tension building within of her, divided between the allure of her impulses and her anxiety about the consequences of giving in. But Marcus's subsequent remarks in the silent tension was broken by a voice that was barely audible. "Remain with." The words lingered in the air like a challenge, like an invitation to cross. "Me, Elena." Elena's breath caught in her throat as she recognized that the decision was now hers, marking the boundary that had been drawn between them. That night, Elena couldn't decide whether to leave or stay and risk everything for a little moment of temptation. Remove Marcus's picture from her thoughts. The way he had gazed at her earlier, that she was restless because of the intensity of his gaze, his closeness, and everything about him. Her thoughts were racing with memories of their shared moments of exhilarating tension as she tossed and turned in bed, seemed to float in midair whenever they were in close proximity to one another. She had always been a composed, restrained individual who considered things carefully and didn't let her feelings to rule her, but Marcus gave her memories that made her feel alive in ways she never imagined. Despite his contact and his remarks about how his presence had left her, feeling both exposed and forceful, and absorbed her at the same time, but she understood she should avoid that. Everything would become more complicated if she crossed a boundary with him, but something inside of her changed. She was no longer the bashful intern who had inadvertently entered his office a few weeks prior. She was someone who could, whether she wanted it or not, she found herself drawn to him as she laid there attempting to make herself. When her phone buzzed, interrupting the night's quiet, Elena reached for her. When she saw Marcus's name on the screen, her heart began to race. She opened the message without thinking. "I need to see you again." Now the words gave her a shock of energy, and before she could completely, her fingers were already drafting a response as she processed what they meant. I'll be her hands trembled as she clicked to submit after 10 minutes, and she hastily put on. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, her heart thumping in her chest, and she hurried out the door after grabbing her clothes and keys. Mixed feelings. Was this a mistake? Should she be acting in this way when she didn't have the responses? But it was evident that she was powerless to stop him. The attraction he had for her, despite her best efforts to convince herself otherwise, every minute of the journey to the office seemed to drag on forever, and her hands were sweating. She tried to relax herself by calming her thoughts, which were preoccupied with the hope of seeing him again. Herself, but she couldn't help but worry about what may occur when she went through those. She convinced herself that she wasn't particularly interested in office doors, searching for anything challenging. She had a job to concentrate on and goals to achieve. However, Marcus was unique. He was strong, mysterious, a natural force, and when she eventually reached the place, she felt as though she could be anyone and do anything in his presence. She parked her car and entered the building, feeling heavy on her feet as they dragged her to the elevator. The only sound that accompanied her was the soft hum of the elevator, so she briefly permitted herself to close her. When the doors opened, she tried to calm the fury raging inside of her with her eyes. Entered the deserted hallway, where a spooky glow was cast by the fluorescent lights. She moved deliberately, but as she approached Marcus's office, each step she made revealed. As she arrived to his office door, her anxiety appeared to worsen, and when she knocked, no one answered at first, but she was going to turn the handle when Marcus stood there, his large form filling the doorway as the door slid wide. She could see the intensity in her black eyes as soon as they met hers. The hunger radiating from him and the longing imprinted on his features were indisputable. His look was like a gentle touch on her skin that made her feel alone. "You came," he whispered in a gruff, low voice, and brimming with an unadulterated, unquestionably good. The one word was like a command, a recognition of the unsaid conflict between them. Elena was unable to speak. Her breath caught in her throat. She nodded, but she was too anxious to do anything else and didn't know how to anticipate. But she was aware that she couldn't go back now that Marcus had entered. As she entered the room, the door was pushed back, opening wider to let her in. She saw that his sharp features were shadowed by the soft glow of the desk lamp in the gloomy illumination. His posture was authoritative as he waited for her near his desk, but there was something about him now. When left unchecked, his customary command over his environment appeared to have slipped, and it was replaced by a much more hazardous, raw desire in the air. Between Elena felt the weight of his body suffocatingly heavy and thick. Look at her while she stood before him, uncertain of what to say or do next. "I didn't anticipate you coming," he added quietly, although she could tell by the expression in his eyes. "But I'm pleased you did." Her pulse raced even faster when Marcus arrived since the statements were straightforward, but had an honesty and truth to them. She felt a surge of pleasure as his fingers brushed over her arm. It was almost as though he was Ella Nena, couldn't stop him from trying her, to see how far she would allow him to go. Every touch, look, and phrase he made caused her body to react. It caused her to have an inside sensation that she had never experienced before. Was both excited and afraid. She couldn't help but feel his draw. "Elena," Marcus said in a whisper, his voice enveloping her like velvet. A spell as she gazed up at him, her heart pounding and her breath coming in short gasps. Outside his office, everything vanished, leaving simply Marcus the man, who had given her emotions she never would have imagined having. She was engrossed in him because of the way he made her feel like the focal point of his universe, even if only for this one night. And then abruptly Marcus brought them closer together, his lips meeting hers with such force that she gasped. The instant she did, there was no hesitation, no question, just wild passion had come, bringing with it both fear and desire, and she was helpless to stop it. Marcus stood from behind his desk, and the tension in the room was palpable. Desk, his intense gaze was fixed on Elena, as if he could see right through her. Her body was rigid as she stood on the opposite side of the room, her heart throbbing in her chest like it may explode at any moment. His eyes were fixed on her, and he approached her with measured, purposeful steps. He moved carefully, slicing through the distance between them with his big frame. Elena felt her breath catch in her throat as the predator approached with precision. Despite her best efforts to remain calm, her body continued to deceive her with each step. For a brief while, his presence appeared to engulf the room, encroaching on her. Everything that used to be between them vanished completely, and I've been... Elena Marcus's voice, a loud growl of longing, pierced the silence as she thought about you. His tone was low and authoritative as he spoke, and Elena could hardly keep up. You intrigue me, she said, buckling her knees, but he never stopped walking. He stammered when he got to her, standing a breath away, and the words made her skin flushed with a mix of uncertainty and something, and her heart quickened. She opened her mouth to say something more unfamiliar that she didn't want to admit, to talk in an attempt to clarify the abrupt bewilderment she experienced, but the words didn't. Her lips parted, but she took a step back instead of making a sound. Unsure of what to say, she quickly glanced at the door, which felt like the only way out. Like a possibility right then, but before she could move a foot, Marcus extended his hand and placed it on. She touched her cheek in a tender, yet possessive way, and took a breath. Sharply at the unexpected touch, sensing his palm's heat leaking into her flesh and causing her heart to quicken. His touch sent a chill of warmth down Elena's jaw, causing her breath to catch at the intimate gesture. Through her, beginning with the point where his fingers touched her flesh, and moving throughout his fingers, followed the contour of her cheek all across her body before delicately brushing. She felt a surge of heat from her lips that made her lightheaded, saying, I believe you understand precisely what I mean, Marcus said, his voice suddenly hoarse, sending a chill down her spine. Elena was unsure of what to say and didn't want to say it. Whatever she desired to flee in order to seek refuge in rationality and distance, but her body had deceived her. She could feel her chest rising and her pulse pounding. Falling with every breath, feeling like a moth imprisoned in a maze of incomprehensible thoughts. Despite all of her instincts telling her to fight before she was drawn to him, the flickering spark of his presence could object or even understand what was taking place. Marcus cradled her face in both of his hands and gently pulled her, but strongly in his direction, and the pull of attraction between them was undeniable. His lips touched hers with a gentle magnetic draw that had been building since they first met. For a little moment, it was only a soft meeting of lips, almost a tender kiss. Lips, but Elena's senses were illuminated by a spark that ignited between them. Before her mind could really comprehend what was occurring, her body reacted, and her lips opened just enough to give him access, and Elena's kiss grew deeper. The world seemed to shrink to the sensation of his tongue on hers, the little scent of his perfume, the warmth of his touch, and the quiet yet powerful Marcus's hands moved down her neck under the intensity of his kiss. Their fingers grazing, as he pulled her in closer, the heat between them grew stronger against the sensitive skin of her collarbone, and she attempted to push back as she felt his heartbeat resonating in time with her own. Make room to comprehend why her body appeared to be responding to him so intensely. But the instant she attempted to break, Marcus's lips tightened a little as he held her, refusing to let them. She couldn't contain the intensity of the gradual but strong kiss. Elena's mind spun as her thoughts clashed in a flurry of want, remorse, and heart pounding in her chest. She had never felt anything like this before, and she had never had a kiss that appeared to take over her. Made her feel as though she may drown in it. Initially, she hesitated before reaching. She felt the substantial muscle as she touched the firm, warm expanse of his chest. His heat was radiating through his shirt's delicate cotton beneath it. The air in the room was so dense with their closeness that it was almost impossible to breathe. The pressure of their kiss, she let her hands stray slightly, shaky fingers following the contours of his shoulder and chest until they touched down. It seemed as though her body was moving on its own initiative as it passed through his hair on the back of his neck. Drawn by, she could not fight the mysterious impulse that caused her fingertips to graze the taut. Marcus vibrated against her, releasing a deep groan and a muscle in his back. His hands slid down, his fingers grazing her waist curve. Sending his lips quickly left hers as a surge of heat passed through her body, leaving Elena gasped as the fiery kisses moved from her jaw to her neck. A wave of yearning was transmitted through her body by the warm, moist touch of his lips. Betraying instead of backing away, she felt overwhelmed and lightheaded as she leaned closer to him. Unable to escape the tumultuous wave of feelings roiling within her, his kiss was possessive and now assertive. She wasn't prepared for the urgency and intensity with which she appeared to demand not just her lips, but her whole existence. Elena felt the distinct hardness of his body as his hands traveled to her back, drawing her flush against him. Her mind cried out for her to distance herself from the obvious evidence of his yearning. Halt to regain control, but her body stayed motionless, trapped in the... She felt herself sinking further in the heat of the moment, unable to think. The world outside this chamber seemed to be unable to withstand the attraction of his magnetic presence. Existed no longer. Just the two of them were caught up in this web of passion and desiring every kiss, every touch, pushing them both into the brink when Elena's lips were swollen when she finally pulled back, and her breath was shallow. She was shaking from the thrill of their kiss, her mind a mess, and she met his stare, her eyes wide with shock, feeling the weight of what had just happened smash down on her. The air was thick with unsaid things, and her heart was still thumping in her chest. The silence was broken again by Marcus's voice, but this time it was filled with words and wants that neither of them could deny. Was unique, it was subtly infused with a promise, and I believe this is simply the Elena wasn't sure what he was saying, but he challenged her and tempted her. She couldn't help but kiss him, which heightened their passion in a way that neither of them could. They anticipated a fire that engulfed both of Marcus's hands, now confident and assuredly walked to her back, drawing her in and squeezing her body against his. Elena could feel the heat radiating from every inch of him, including the strong muscles in his chest. Her body responded to the radiance emanating from him and the obvious evidence of his yearning. Her heart began to race and her veins began to pump blood like wildfire. She had never felt anything similar prior to this intense rush of desire and pain. That was so powerful down within her that it left her speechless. It was more than physically, she gasped. It was something primordial that she had not expected, but was unable to control. His hands tightened on his lips as he made a gentle moan of surrender, longing. He acted as though he was worried that she may go, but she didn't want to. She wanted him more than she could have ever dreamed as his lips departed. Hers grudgingly, but his breathing was labored, and the passion between them remained. And his need was reflected in the darkness as his chest rose and fell against hers, as though he was having trouble breathing. For a time they just stared at one another, each of them with a burning expression in their eyes. Both of them were caught up in the intensity of the recent events and were attempting to understand the storm that had suddenly snatched them away, causing Elena's skin to tingle where he touched her, and her pulse to pound in her ears. Had touched her in the same spot where he still touched her, and his passionate, nearly rapacious. And she sensed that she was losing herself in it, in the magnitude of the bond that appeared to unite them. His voice was harsh and raw as he broke the silence, and his fingertips touched her flesh, shooting sparks through her body. There was silence between them. "I want more," he whispered, his voice deep with longing. Her heart skipped a beat as he spoke in such an honest and needy manner. He was speaking to her from the bottom of her heart, to the longing she didn't express and the wants she had concealed. Completely comprehend how Elena's breath caught as she attempted to speak, but was caught. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out of her throat. When every fiber in her body was screaming her to give in to the pull and give in to him, when her body was betraying her, his hands traced the slope of her back between them, sliding up her spine, and Elena's body responded instinctively as she felt herself melting into him, was burning, and every nerve ending was glowing with a thrill that she couldn't ignore. Longer the way he evoked feelings in her, the way he caused her to yearn for something. Her heart was pounding harder in her chest, and she was breathing more deeply. Weak gasps as she fought to ignore the logical side of her worries. The intellect that cried out that she was entering dangerous land was incorrect. However, there was nothing wrong with the way he caressed her. In fact, it felt more natural than anything she had ever experienced. Mind attempted to counter and remind her of the repercussions, but the wish that overtook her, drowning away any rational thinking she might have had. She had never felt more alive or conscious of her own body or desires. For the first time, his contact made her feel as though she were coming to life, and she put her hands on his chest. She could feel his heart beating quickly against the hard muscle beneath. His shirt as her quivering fingers moved over it. She sensed the anxiety as her palms matched her own frantic rhythm. The hunger between them was so intense that it nearly choked him. Elena tilted her as they traveled down to her neck, leaving a trail of fire in their wake. Head back, giving him more of herself, and she can't help but pull him in. Closer to experience more of him and fully immerse herself in his kisses were demanding and persistent, and she felt herself slipping further with each one. Her hands slipped to his shoulders and gripped him, giving herself over to him more fully, as though she was afraid that if she didn't reply, she would collapse. She was unable to contain the intensity with which the fire between them increased with each contact. Kiss, deepening the bond until Elena thought she was going to. Despite her dizziness and the haze of want clouding her mind, she wanted to feel this. She wanted him, and she couldn't stop herself. This connection, this passion, and the authority he had over her until Marcus eventually broke the kiss. Elena's body trembled, her breath was ragged, and her lips were swollen. She blinked in an attempt to regain her composure and make sense of the intensity of what they had discussed. Her heart was still thumping in her chest from the tornado of feelings and sensations that had overtaken her, and she felt light-aided appeared to be stuck between the fevered dream of his touch and reality. Marcus's eyes glowed intensely with an emotion she couldn't quite identify, a need that reflected her own, but also something more profound, something unadulterated. "I want you, Elena." His eyes remained fixed on her as he spoke, his voice growling as the words sank into her flesh. And Elena was able to see in his eyes how deeply he needed him and how deeply he felt. Now the unquestionable attraction that had drew them together was the bond that had been developing between them for weeks. At this point, she was unsure of what would happen next, the risks involved, and the implications. Despite the repercussions, she knew that she had never felt more alive. With him, she was definitely more in tune with herself, and for the first time she did not want to push back, but rather wanted to give in and allow him to, "Then take me," she said in a whisper, "to see where this would lead." Her body ached with anticipation as she shook with need before the words were spoken. She had the power to halt them, and while they hung in midair, there was no turning back. The days that followed in a daze, every moment was more intense than Marcus's previous fixation on Elena. Expanded rapidly, and she couldn't help but notice how his eyes followed her every time they crossed paths. Paths she could feel his gaze on her, a steady pressure that excited and unnerved her. He would late at night, he calls her into his office and requests that she stay and assist with activities that would otherwise. The way he stared at her and the way his voice fell when he spoke seemed insignificant, but there was more to it than that. Shouted her name, and every word and look appeared to be filled with care that she was unable to longer act as though Elena's heart didn't beat. Her pulse would accelerate as she entered his office, where the once neutral and uninteresting walls had changed. Felt as though the air itself was growing with an energy that could not be ignored. The space between them got electrified as the unsaid wants became thick and heavy. Usually he would ask her to manage some minor aspect of his schedule or arrange papers, but his gaze would constantly follow her, dark and piercing, while she burned with need. That was evident, and each action she took seemed to entice him more, like Elena was caught in a flame, and she couldn't help but wonder whether he knew how much power he held over her. Between the attraction she experienced for him and the doubt that had deeply ingrained in her, she had never encountered something similar before. She was shy and reserved, and I had never experienced such intensity or overwhelming need. Despite her natural resistance to the pull, she was unable to resist the urge to get closer to him. Despite her better judgment, she was unable to control the emotional tempest that had suddenly taken over her. She would find herself struggling to balance her lack of expertise with the developing bond she felt for Marcus. Over what she was saying, avoiding his eyes and blushing anytime his eyes touched hers, that hunger appeared to reach her own soul with that glance. But every time he summoned her to his office, and she felt his presence weighing heavily on her, she couldn't force herself to refuse him, since his presence was like a drug. She was losing herself gradually due to the complexity of her. Elena couldn't seem to stop having feelings for him, and the more time they spent together, the more she felt like herself. She wondered whether he had intended it this way as she slipped into his orbit and became entangled in his infatuation. If his actions and unwavering focus were all a part of some complex game he was playing, but she was unable to shake the feelings he gave her, despite the concerns that were lurking in the back of her mind. Every touch, every word, and every moment they had together seemed to spark something. There was something inside of her that she couldn't control, and that she didn't quite comprehend the evenings when she ended up staying late in his office to assist with yet another work, that she could saw the tension growing between them. It seemed as though the space between them was thickened with yearning. Marcus was no longer just a boss, she thought, narrowing until she could practically taste the energy crackling in the room. She no longer merely looked up to him as a guy. He had turned into an obsession and overwhelming influence in her life, and she felt more and more attracted to him. He would stand uncomfortably near to her and hold his breath as she became engrossed in him. Warm against her skin, and she would resist the temptation to lean in and surrender to the attraction that seemed to intensify. Stronger every day, and when he spoke to her, his voice would stutter. He would smile and make a slight change that made her tremble and her heart rush. That was deadly and knowing, as though he knew how he affected, as though he took pleasure in it. Elena couldn't help but be attracted to him, that everything in her cried out for him because of how he made her feel. Even when he wasn't present, he dominated her thoughts. But she was terrified by the apparent control he had over her, and the way he could make her feel so alive, exposed and vulnerable. She would lie awake at night, her body still tingling from their touches, her mind racing with images of him. Discuss the intimate moments that appeared to conflate personal and professional life, but she didn't. She had always taken pride in being in charge of her life, but she didn't know how to stop what was happening to her, her feelings on controlling them, but she felt herself with Marcus, disintegrating in ways she never imagined. But despite how much she tried to resist by pulling away, but she couldn't seem to get rid of her need for him, the intense need to be close to him and feel his touch every day that she discovered. She found herself thinking about him more and more, fascinated by the way he, observing how his touch made her feel like the only woman in the world. She was unable to ignore it any longer. She became dependent on him because of how he made her feel and caused her to lose herself in him, even though she was a part of her enjoyed the chaos he brought into her life. She was afraid of what this represented. The days spent, it seemed like a never-ending struggle between dread and desire when he called her into his office. The need to maintain some degree of control and the want to give in to him. But the more they engaged, the more she became aware that she was losing control with each second that went by, each muttered, each stolen look. Elena had always felt strong and capable of holding herself together. But with Marcus, she was disintegrating gradually, and because the obsession had already begun, there was no way to stop it. Started, and despite her best efforts to fight it, she knew she was gradually taking on the characteristics of his body and soul. Despite their obvious chemistry, Elena struggled to keep her under control. Emotions, and she had to fight to keep her heart intact all the time. I focused to prevent getting too caught up in the web Marcus was creating. She did not want to be just another one of his conquests, another short-lived moment in a man's life around her, who enjoyed controlling women. She wasn't only an office worker or an accessory to his universe. Yet in spite of all of her internal opposition, Marcus was unrelenting. And each time he gazed at her, the attraction between them was evident. Every time their hands unintentionally touched, a spark would light inside of her, starting a fire that only got hotter. She could practically taste the fire between them and the raging hunger that grew stronger every day. threatening to devour them both, and those were the times she was most afraid and couldn't allow herself to fall into the trap of believing that this relationship was anything more than an overwhelming one, because she was special to him. Physical attraction, but Marcus wasn't being straightforward about his desire for her, and she could sense it in every word he said, every look he gave her, and every touch that lasted too long. His intense gaze left her gasping for air, and there was something frightening about the way he looked at her, doubting anything she believed to be true about herself, even her boundaries. Whatever she did to detach herself from him, no matter how hard she tried, it always looked like he was always one step ahead of her and anticipated every move she made with all of her strength. To depart from the workplace that night, her heart racing, in the hopes that perhaps some time away might give her the time and space she needs to recover control. But as she sensed his presence behind her, like a shadow as she reached for the door handle, she didn't have time to respond before he arrived because of the energy emanating through the air as though he were drawn to her. His hand was standing just behind her, locking around her arm with a surprising amount of softness, despite the severity of his hold. "Don't walk away from me, Elena," he urged in a low voice, and persistent, with a strong undercurrent of longing permeating each word. There was a strength in his voice, an authoritative presence that forced her to halt in her tracks. The authority was not just in his words, but also in the way he held her, as though he knew she was gasping for air, was on the verge of losing control, as though he knew she wanted to back off, but that she couldn't yet acknowledge how he had already owned her, his fingers warm, and for a brief time, the world seems to pause as Strong coiled around her arm. The office was silent, the city's hum was muffled, and everything in. He was experiencing the intensity in his eyes and the overpowering feeling of being caught between an uncontrollable want and an unshakable fear. Marcus said, "I won't let you go," still talking, hardly more than a whisper now. Yet the weight of it hung over them, dense with an intensity that prevented her from moving or clearly thinking what he was saying, as even though they were straightforward, they seemed to be a proclamation or a pledge that he would keep her to a promise she wasn't sure she was prepared to accept. Yet the way his thumb delicately touched her flesh, his intense gaze on her, made her feel vulnerable and accelerated her heartbeat. She had tried to ignore the feelings that were developing inside of her in order to maintain her distance, but they were getting more and more. It was hard to deny that Marcus had already marked her and had started to assert ownership of every aspect of her, whether or not Elena was prepared for it. Swallowed forcefully in an attempt to control her breathing and muster the resolve to pull away and convince him that despite her best efforts, she couldn't be just another piece of property that he could acquire. The words never seemed to leave her as she tried to persuade herself that she had to resist and defend her heart. Mouth, the raw electricity between them, immobilized her by the way his presence permeated the space due to the indisputable allure that grew stronger every second. He wasn't going to let her go, and the idea both excited and frightened her. She wanted to be resilient, to leave that office without ever turning to face anyone other than the aspect of her that he had roused with his touch, and his words were a battle within her, and she was fighting back with everything she had. On the one hand, she was fierce and wanted to flee before she lost herself entirely, but a part of her wanted to give in and allow him to take authority to give in to the indisputable chemistry that had been developing between them since the beginning of the E. The way he gazed at her now, the desire in his eyes seemed to erode her determination, leaving her exposed and defenseless. He was dangerous, and she was desperate for something she didn't really understand. Was aware of that, yet there was something alluring and energizing about the danger that gave her a sense of aliveness. He was more than simply a guy now. He was a power in a way she had never experienced before, a storm from which she was unable to escape. And yet, in spite of her better judgment, even though the sensible half of her told her to leave, she couldn't help but be pulled to him. She wasn't sure why. Whether it was desire, love, or something more complex between them, she wasn't prepared to comprehend. But as soon as she looked back at him, her body ached from the need to make the Marcus didn't wait for the space between them to open up and feel the warmth of his touch again. Rather than responding, his hand moved from her arm to her waist, drawing her closer. There was no getting away from him at that moment, his breath blending with hers. She could feel the intensity of his yearning pressing on her as she fled the pull that had grown too great to deny. Despite her desire to resist, she realized she had already lost Elena's. She had always been cautious, but her emotions were a whirlwind spinning in a wild dance that she couldn't seem to manage. She was cautious with her heart, never letting the rash wave of want carry her away. But Marcus's passion was, it wasn't only the way he gazed at her or the way his touch delivered a message that she had never experienced before. She felt a surge of electricity in her veins. It was his presence that engulfed her, taking up all of her thoughts and actions. There was no doubting that she had attempted to resist it in order to maintain some sort of control, but it was like attempting difficult to contain the ocean with one hand since his perseverance had worn her out, gradually dismantling the barrier she had erected around herself until all what was left was a burning need that she was unable to control. His intensely passionate eyes had plagued her dreams, and even when she was awake, she sensed the magnetic force pulling her toward. Although there was a lot of lust in him, it wasn't the only thing. There was something deeper and far more perilous because he had managed to get to the very center of her, into her heart, and with she had attempted to persuade herself that it was only an infatuation, but every day that tug grew stronger. The more time she spent with him, the more she understood that it was a fleeting fixation that would soon burn out. She was deceiving herself. She didn't know how much she loved him, and her sentiments were deeper than she had ever imagined. There was something about Marcus that made her feel alive, so she could act as though she didn't care for a while. Something that, for the first time, gave her a sense of being noticed, and it was that constant pain that ultimately drove her to her breaking point. One evening, following yet another exhausting workday, following yet another instance in which their gazes locked and their bodies ached for one, the tension between them had grown too great for another Elena to contain, reached its zenith, and she realized she could no longer resist its draw. Wasn't only about their physical attraction, it was also about their common connection, which he seemed to comprehend. She felt more exposed and vulnerable than anyone else had ever done. However, when he leaned in her, she felt liberated from that vulnerability. Elena felt his resolve as his breath warmed her ear, and his lips were so close that she could feel the heat emanating from him. Disintegrate. There was no more space for uncertainty. She needed and desired him. Their kiss was frantic, as though they both understood that they had to have him right then and there, and nothing else mattered. Was the moment that would alter everything? It was a passionate kiss that was powered by feelings. Until now, none of them had quite acknowledged that his hands were all over the place. She didn't resist as he touched and pulled her, acting as though he was taking her as his own. Instead, she gave her body over to him, reacting to his touch in ways that she had always been cautious. But suddenly she was doing something she never would have imagined. The night was a flurry of passion, with each moment more intense than the last. Caution thrown to the breeze. More violent than the last until the storm passed, and they were both left tangled in the blankets and out of breath. Following the conclusion of their passionate encounter, they lay together in the room filled with the Elena's heart continued to race, due to the weight of what had just happened. Still humming from the sensation of his lips, the touch of his hands and the intense surge of feelings that had crashed over her, leaving her unsure of what to think and how to feel. Realized that she had changed from the person she had been prior to Marcus's. She was altered in ways she couldn't understand by the influence that had crept in. As she laid there next to him, she was afraid because she wanted more. She craved more. The room was so quiet that her thoughts were disorganized, although Marcus's velvety, deep voice broke the silence before she could sort through them. Like though it were the only, "I knew you'd be mine, Elena," he said, his words colored with, "I knew you were," she said with a confidence that chilled her. "Intended for me." His statements were more than just a proclamation. They were a claim and a promise, as though, despite Elena's best efforts to reject it, he had already determined her fate. She knew in her heart that he was correct and that there was no going back now, that he had already left his mark on her body and soul as he had always intended her heart and intellect, and she was unable to deny that she had fallen in love with him. Everything she had struggled to hide from him was now his to have on her body. She wanted to protest and argue that it wasn't that easy, but she couldn't admit that she had also desired this. She had desired him, wanted to be his, but she wasn't sure whether she would now that she had finally given in. Could ever find her way out again. The long, simmering obsession between them had finally exploded. And since the storm had arrived and Elena had been drawn into a world where nothing seemed to be as it should be, where she, her body and heart were entirely his, and as she lay there with Marcus's arms wrapped around her, Elena became aware that the moment she had feared had arrived and gone. She had gone too far, and now there was no going back. Become his, and in a manner that went against all she had ever experienced, he had become hers. She was aware that the barriers she had meticulously erected around herself had been broken, and that he was now the only person left. Had straddled the boundary between fixation and want, and she was unable to deny her addiction to him, just as he was to now. No matter how hard she tried, there was no getting out of it. Despite her best efforts to resist, she convinced herself that it was too late because their relationship was too deep and their need for one another was too much to handle. And as she lay there in the room's silent darkness, his promise lingered in the air, echoing in her memory. "I knew you'd be mine," she shuddered, not out of fear, but because she knew he had been yes. There was no way out of this. Just the two of them were trapped. She was unable to resist the strong hold of passion, obsession, and want. Fight despite her best efforts, and as the first light of day approached, Elena realized that her life had altered irrevocably when the light of day broke through the curtains. The girl who had formerly been the cautious person who had previously kept her heart closed was no longer there. Instead, there was a woman who had fully devoted herself to Marcus, and at that precise moment, as the Elena became aware that she was still feeling the heat from his body radiating against hers. She was his, not the person she had been, and she would always be Elena. Had always taken pleasure in her ability to regulate her emotions, but with Marcus, despite her best efforts to control her emotions, every moment she spent with him seemed to elude her, strengthen their bond. Initially, there had only been a mere attraction between them, longing that she had attempted to brush off as a passing feeling. However, the longer she was with him, the more those sentiments developed into something much more strong, something she couldn't deny, and she began to yearn for him in certain ways. She was unable to comprehend the need for his touch, words, presence, and every word he said seemed to pierce her heart more deeply, leaving an enduring impression that she was unable to remove. She reminded herself that it was only the intensity of the moment, and that the feelings would go as soon as the desire did. But with Marcus, it wasn't so easy. His touch made everything seem different. Was more than just physical. It seemed to reach into her spirit and draw her in ways she was unable to avoid. Nevertheless, Elena made a valiant effort to keep control even as her feelings for him grew stronger, since she was afraid of how she didn't want to lose the power he had over her, which made her vulnerable. Herself and him to be only another item that he might take and throw away as he liked it. But whenever they were together, those anxieties seemed to go away. The strong tug she felt toward him overwhelmed the background. Felt as like her body and heart belonged to him instead of her. And what most frightened her was that she didn't mind that Marcus's fixation on her had just gotten more intense. And he became more possessive when he saw how much of an impact he had on her. He would remind her frequently, and with considerable, he would declare, "You're mine now, Elena," with such conviction that she was his. His authoritative, low voice sent a chill down her spine. "And I'll never let you go." His words were more than a simple proclamation. They were a vow and a commitment. Things stayed with her for a long time after he spoke them, and even though she felt frightened each time a tiny part of her couldn't help but feel like she belonged when she spoke to them. Feeling of being sought after in a manner she had never experienced previously, she always stayed away from anyone who would try to manipulate her, yet it was different with Marcus because she was adored and not under control. His own fiercely protective manner, and despite her best efforts to distance herself, she was unable to do so since he had wormed his way into her thoughts and into her heart. And suddenly he took up all of her waking hours. She should have been concentrating on other things, but instead she found herself thinking about him, picturing his touch, kiss the way he made her feel. Their infatuation was like a narcotic, and she had developed an addiction to the idea of living without him. Near was so awful that she lost all memory of how it had been before he had entered her life prior to him claiming her in ways she was unaware were possible. Yet in spite of the love, it grew inside of her. A persistent worry that she worried losing persisted. She was afraid of getting so caught up in his ambitions that she wouldn't be able to tell where he ended. And she had first witnessed how effortlessly he could manage the situation with a single glance, and how he could command her. But she wasn't prepared for how much she would start to want for that authority. He showered her with attention and gave her the impression that she was the only lady in the world, and the seclusion of Elena was all his, and yet a part of her during their times together when the outside world vanished. Another part of her didn't want to resist it any longer because she was afraid of what that meant for her freedom. Yes, she was drowning in him, but she was also adrift in a sea of feelings that he had triggered. There was no looking back. She could not dispute that Marcus had taken possession of her body and spirit. In some sense, she shared his desire for "you're mine," and he would whisper against her skin, and each time he did so, the connection became stronger between them, and Elena had to acknowledge, in spite of her misgivings, that she desired to be the center of his universe and to be the one who belonged to him. She was the one he could never let go of. She wanted to take up all of his thoughts and breaths. They were playing a risky game that involved feelings, but neither of them was prepared to give up. Elena had made an effort to be strong and keep her distance, but now she was. She always thought she was sliding more and more into his grasp every day, could regulate her emotions, but she understood that she had no control over Marcus, and the knowledge of her love for him both frightened and excited her. He wasn't merely an emotion. Rather, he was a fire that blazed fiercely, threatening to devour all in its path. She was unable to stop it, and to be honest, she didn't want Marcus to make her experience emotions she never would have imagined. And now that she had experienced that love's passion, she couldn't. "I'll never let you go, Elena," he would repeat. "Imagine living without it." And every time his comments seemed like a commitment, a legally binding agreement, she was unable to leave even though she didn't want to. Wished to break off from him since their relationship was too strong and absorbing, even though it scared her so much that she was unable to leave even if she didn't want to. She was his, fully, and the more she struggled with it, the more she understood that she didn't need to resist it at all. No longer had to keep her emotions in check because she had Marcus. Discovered something to lose herself in, something to give herself to, and as his hands caressed her face tenderly, and his eyes finally met Elena's, acknowledged the reality that had been brewing beneath the surface the entire time. She loved him deeply. That both frightened her and gave her a sense of fulfillment she had never had before she was his, and he was hers. And regardless of how much she tried to reject it, she resisted the attraction between them. Their bond was clear. Was this way from the beginning, even before they exchanged words, and it had always been written in the stars? And as the days went by and their bond grew stronger, Elena finally realized that she was entirely and utterly his, and she wouldn't have it any other way. Things started to change because of Marcus's love for Elena. He had a deep-seated, cold, calculating CEO who used to dominate with an iron hand. Unaware of the needs of everyone around him, he changed completely. Someone who couldn't stand the idea of being separated from her, as if her presence had ignited something that had been buried deep inside him for years and kept hidden in the recesses of his heart. He was no longer a guy motivated only by power and ambition. Instead, he was a man who every second spent apart from Elena felt endless, and he finally discovered himself yearning for her in ways he never thought were possible before. Been resistant to love and untouchable, with his feelings hidden under layers of control and distance. But when he was with Elena, that facade started to crumble. surprise her with tiny presents and tokens of affection that conveyed his deep concern for her. His sensitivity allowed him to do things that no one else had ever witnessed. Flowers showed up on her desk, each one delicate and colorful, reflecting how he would write brief messages on her car's windshield because he cared about her. Things had deeper significance than words could express, including dinners in small restaurants where they were the only two. When he sat across from her, his warm smile and gentle eyes were so in contrast to the man who used to dominate with an iron hand. He started sharing bits of. He told her about his early years and the difficulties he had, things he had never discussed with anyone else. Struggling to reach his current state of the loneliness that accompanied success, he disclosed his doubts and fears in ways that no one else had ever understood. And Elena found herself falling even deeper in love with him as he revealed himself to her. The Marcus she had before dreaded and admired from afar was no longer a faraway character, but rather a real, vulnerable, and loving man. Her in ways she never imagined possible, but Marcus wasn't the only one transforming her. Elena was also going through a change of her own, the quiet, restrained woman who had reluctantly joined his life, uncertain of how to handle the powerful feelings he evoked in her, changing her into a new person who was braver, more self-assured, and more eager. Marcus's affection allowed her to embrace her fantasies and feel free to explore portions of she had previously concealed herself and had always been wary and uncertain about her own worth. But she blossomed the walls she had constructed under his tender gaze. Surrounding her heart started to disintegrate one by one until just the unadulterated love she felt for she discovered that she was accepting the lady she had and letting go of her fears. Always been inside, but she had never dared to show it to the outside world. Therefore, she started to begin by taking tiny risks, such as letting herself wear the clothing she had always adored, but never imagined she could manage to speak up during meetings when she had something significant to say. And with each modification, she felt more alive, stronger, and in harmony with the dreams that had always simmered beneath the surface. But Elena's inner world was just as noticeable as her outward change. Transforming the fear of being harmed or injured that had before prevented her from abandon started to fade in the face of Marcus's steadfast love for her. Never experienced love so intense, and as it engulfed her, she felt as though she could take on the world. Her once reticent and timid heart was now filled with passion that she didn't hesitate to show, and she noticed that her confidence was increasing. Not only with Marcus, but also with her surroundings. Although, in spite of these modifications, their relationship only became more solid after being loaded with. Now, doubt and hesitancy served as a solid basis for love and trust. Every moment spent with Marcus felt like a fresh start, a step towards something more profound and lasting. Were now intertwined in their lives rather than two distinct people attempting to navigate their respective worlds. Connected by their love for one another, Elena's metamorphosis was more than simply an expression of Marcus's love for her, and it demonstrated how he genuinely accepted her for who she was. He loved her for who she was, without trying to change her or asking her to be someone else. For the way she had always taken care of people, for her quiet strength, and in return she discovered that she loved him more deeply than she had previously realized. She loved him for the way he had helped her become the woman she had always been, not simply for the guy he was. Wished to be as Elena found herself becoming more open as they spent more time together. More to him by letting him see the aspects of her that she had concealed. She shared her aspirations and ambitions for the future, as well as the things that had always meant a lot to her and Marcus. For the first time, he actually listened. He saw what she was saying, not simply heard it. When she felt that way, it was all the difference because she truly saw her. Genuinely loved and respected the closeness they had, which went beyond just physical contact. It was spiritual and emotional, and there was no denying that their love was a power that united them in ways that words could not express. And as the change proceeded, she came to understand that this was only the beginning of with Marcus by her side. She was able to handle anything since she had grown into a strong, loving woman who was prepared to face the world with the man she loved by her side. She had before doubted her own value. Her position in the world, she had discovered her power, her purpose, and together they were unstoppable in the man's arms who adored her. Together they would confront whatever lay ahead since their love had changed them both. And as they progressed, Elena was aware that nothing could stop them from moving forward after the internal metamorphosis. Marcus's love for her was just the beginning of something far more potent, was more than just a woman. She was a formidable force who had reached her own maturity and was prepared to accept Elena's. Breath was still labored from the intensity, no matter what life had to offer. Connection had developed between them while they slept together, her skin feeling warm against his. In the aftermath, her pulse felt like it was racing in her chest. Every part of her vibrated with the unmistakable bond she shared with Marcus, throbbing with every beat. Her eyes caught the gentle brightness of the moonlight that seeped through the window as she tilted her face slightly to face him. His features were illuminated by the glass, giving him an almost ethereal appearance. And her voice, even though she was silent, her comments were firm and emotional when they were ultimately spoken. "I love you," she muttered, revealing herself in a quiet, trembling confession. The weight of those 3 words pressing down on her chest, yet simultaneously felt so freeing. I believed I could sense this because of the vulnerability in her voice. Seemed as if she had at last given herself permission to let go of the uncertainties, anxieties, and insecurities that had once tormented her, causing the barriers she had painstakingly erected around her heart to collapse at the mere realization that now left her lips. Feeling her emotions twist and her chest tighten within her like a tempest as she prepared for his reaction, terrified of how, even though it would ruin their lovely moment together, she knew she had everything she needed the instant his eyes met hers. To understand that his eyes were unwavering and that he had no second thoughts about what he felt his lips twist into that warm, comforting smile that he always had. Gently reaching up his fingers, he grounded her in the here and now. The gentle, almost respectful hand was used to brush a wayward lock of her hair behind her ear. For a little period, he examined her, his dark eyes probing hers with such intensity that she gasped, as though attempting to. His voice was steady, full of words, as he searched for the ideal method to convey the depth of his feelings for her. He talked with assurance and love, as if he had been clinging to these words for far longer than he had ever. "I love you too, Elena," he said quietly as he had expected. "You're everything to me." Seemed to surround her with its warmth. His words were so simple that they made her heart skip a beat and her chest tighten with a sense of relief and happiness. Before meeting him, she had no idea that happiness was possible. It seemed as though, for the first time in her life, she felt fully seen and understood, and a burden had been lifted. Their relationship was one of mutual understanding and love that went hand in hand. It was a really raw emotional connection that went beyond the physical and surface level interactions that most people encountered. And genuine, something that went beyond all the difficulties and tribulations of the world. He was her home, and now the individual the person who loved her without hesitation and without doubt grasped her in a way that no one else had. Leaned over her shoulder, drawing her in closer as he put his arms around her in a warm embrace. They lay there in close embrace for a while in a certain kind of quiet. That spoke a lot, their pulses pounding in time as they shared this peaceful. The world outside appeared to vanish as they shared a holy time in the room. Seemed as though time had stopped for them, giving them this space. Elena felt as though she could finally breathe completely just by being in his arms. No longer burdened by uncertainty or dread, she was right where she was supposed to be. Be with the person she was supposed to be with, and the future didn't seem uncertain or full of concerns anymore. Regarding Marcus's potential problems, everything seemed plausible, as if whatever life threw at them, they would deal with it together. There was an unsaid vow in his caress, in the way he embraced her, in the way the air surrounding their bodies seemed to fit together like 2 parts of a puzzle that have always belonged together. Throb with the vitality of their relationship, which was formed not simply out of passion, but also calm times like these, when they could understand one another just by being there, without using words. Together was sufficient, and Elena came to the realization as they lay there still encircled by one another's arms. She had never experienced anything so genuine as this love and connection. It was all she had ever desired, and more than a transient emotion or a brief attraction. Found in Marcus, whom she had always desired but never imagined finding, and now that she had it, she moved her head slightly to look into his eyes once again, determined not to let it go. All of the words she wanted to say at that very moment were stuck in her throat. To flee, but Marcus didn't have to listen to them because of the manner he realized he knew how she hugged him close, pressing herself against him as if she could never get enough. Precisely what she was feeling, and in the silent silence of the room, they exchanged a pledge without uttering a single word, that regardless of what transpired following. Since their love was a power that neither of them could ignore, and that would overcome everything, they would face it together, support them through whatever lay ahead, and love grew in Elena's heart. She closed her eyes because it was so intense and pure that it nearly overcame her. She could feel Marcus's heart beating steadily against her chest, and she realized that everything was, yes, everything was as it should be, and they were in the exact location that were destined to be together, and nothing could ever alter the fact that she was loved and at home. And as long as she was with him, Elena, she was prepared to face whatever happened next. And Marcus's romance proceeded to develop with a level of intensity neither of them had ever thought was possible. Past, their relationship only became stronger, creating an unbreakable link that bound their hearts in a manner that made it impossible for either of them to deny the time they spent. Despite the fact that it felt like a dream, the dream was so genuine and unquestionable that there were moments when Elena couldn't fully appreciate what they had. Sometimes she would just stare at Marcus, immersed in the absolute knowledge of his existence, and her heart was filled with a love that was nearly too great to understand. The experience was all-encompassing and all-consuming, unlike anything she had ever experienced. However, it was also gentle and kind, a steady supply of passion and warmth. That seemed to light her soul every time she touched him or spoke to him, as if she could be herself without fear of criticism or rejection in his. She saw devotion and acceptance in those eyes, and it made everything else easier. Fade into the background. When they were together, it seemed as if the outside world didn't exist, since they had more than enough in common, and their love had grown stronger and more unbreakable. Something that every day spent with could never be diluted by time or distance. Another day, Marcus made her understand how fortunate she was to have found him. Their bond was unique and priceless, and it had developed in a manner that seemed instinctive, as if they had always been intended to meet. There were only two people who had fallen completely in love, no games or pretenses. Two individuals who loved one another unconditionally discussed their future together and frequently made plans. Elena could feel the thrill in her chest as they dreamed together, talked about their potential lives and the type of life they would have together. She pictured waking up next to him every morning, their lives entwined in every manner she could think of as she grew older and shared everything, from the ordinary to the remarkable. Because even the everyday situations seemed special when Marcus was around. Their love was so uncommon and pure that it made her heart race. Enthusiasm and expectation for the life they had not yet experienced in its whole. They discussed family and the potential traits of their future children, and each discussion strengthened Elena's. There was no doubt in her heart that Marcus was the person she was destined to spend the rest of her life with. She believed she had found the one who fulfilled her and made her feel whole. Together, they had already produced something lovely in ways she wasn't even aware were lacking. Yet when Elena considered what lay ahead, she was overcome with happiness. Every touch, smile, and giggle they exchanged only served to reinforce the depth of their romance, and Elena realized every day that Marcus was her forever. He was the man she had always been looking for, dreamed of, even though she was unaware of it at the time. Their bond was unquestionably an unwritten contract. Something went beyond words, a connection that had grown during their quiet times together. It was in the way he held her and in the sly looks and loving motions. He kissed her as if he couldn't get enough of it, and the way his fingers touched hers was in the way. They conversed silently about how he could always tell what she needed and desired before she said anything. She had never felt so cherished, so noticed, and so understood. Elena perceived Marcus's love for her as a reflection of her own, which had only gotten stronger, and he became increasingly intense over time, becoming the focal point of her entire universe. Someone who brightened every day and gave each moment greater significance by being therein. She had learned to value her life as a gift, and every day she found herself growing more and more. There were no more uncertainties or worries with him as she became more in love with him. Was at home, and she felt confident that they would overcome whatever obstacles they might encounter in the future. Nothing could separate them. Their love served as a stronghold and a refuge where neither. They talked a lot about their plans for the future and if they ever wanted to leave. Discussed the house they would purchase, the vacations they would take, and the life they would create. They planned their lives with the kind of excitement that only occurs when two people are so committed to each other, raising a family, so enamored that the world appears to open out in front of them, full with limitless possibilities. The idea of spending her later years with Marcus filled Elena's heart with a profound, unchanging sense of serenity. She felt whole and assured that here was where she was supposed to be with him. He was her heart's treasure, like if the missing piece of her soul had finally been discovered. Home, and she was his. She was certain that they were destined to be together for the rest of their lives. Marcus expressed his affection for her daily through both large and small actions. He was always there for her in tender moments, encouraging her to do anything she did. He gave her the strength to pursue her goals and be the greatest version of herself, capable and loved in ways she never imagined. Together they had crafted a tale of love that was exclusively theirs. Theirs alone, a tale that had just started but seemed to last a lifetime. Countless memories. It was a love that had endured hardships and grown more resilient over time and developed into something very remarkable. And Elena knew without a doubt that this was only the beginning and that they had a lot more chapters to go. With Marcus by her side, she felt compelled to tell their story and eagerly anticipated what lay ahead for them. Like though the future was bright and theirs to make, and she could handle anything. A future filled with love, laughter, and joy that Elena couldn't have imagined. She thought of life without him, and that she didn't have to because they were together now and forever. Heart with greater happiness than she ever imagined.